What would you do if the one place that taught you how to survive was the very thing you had to give up just to save the man you loved from drowning under debts he could no longer hide? By the time the sun dropped behind the garden fence, Tu Tien would be standing in a warm kitchen with tears caught in her throat, serving Ange Jack a bowl of bitter gourd soup while quietly asking him to do the one thing that would break her heart: sell the farm they had built their days around, leave behind the little life that had taught them peace, and begin again somewhere smaller, somewhere humbler, somewhere less beautiful but safer. Yet that painful decision did not begin at the dinner table. It began at dawn, in the stillness of a countryside morning, when she stepped into the green garden under the warm Vietnamese light and reached for the young bitter gourds hanging from the vines like small, stubborn promises. It continued at the market, where she smiled, weighed, bargained, and sold them one by one, pretending life was simple while worry kept pressing against her chest. It deepened when she came home, fed the cat, bought meat, and cooked with the quiet determination of a woman who knew love is often measured not in words, but in how much sorrow a person is willing to carry alone before finally asking the truth to come sit down at the table. Because some evenings do not end with romance. Some end with sacrifice. And the cruelest part is that sometimes sacrifice is the purest form love can take. The morning opened gently, but the warmth arrived early. It was the kind of Vietnamese morning that already carried the full taste of the season before the sun had fully climbed. The wooden walls of the little house held last night's heat. The air smelled faintly of damp soil, leaves, and the breath of a garden not yet stirred by wind. Somewhere beyond the yard, a bird called once, then again. But inside the room, Tu Tien was already awake, feeling the heaviness in the air long before she rose from bed. She sat up slowly and pressed a hand to her forehead, not because she was ill, but because the day itself felt thick. The weather had been turning hotter, the kind of heat that changes tempers, slows the body, and makes every task feel twice as heavy. For a moment, she looked toward the doorway, toward the pale gold light beginning to stretch across the yard, and let herself breathe before standing. Then she stepped into the garden. The sight still moved her every time. Vines climbing where she had guided them, leaves broad and green, moist soil dark beneath bare feet, and hanging among the leaves were the bitter gourds, young, full, round enough, some still with flowers clinging to their stems, proof that they had been taken at just the right time. She reached out carefully and touched one, smiling to herself with a softness no audience could have fully understood. She loved this land because it was honest. In Vietnam, she often thought, the weather itself teaches people how to live. The South carries a warm, familiar brightness. The North offers a softer chill that lingers in the bones. Rain can arrive suddenly, without warning, then vanish just as quickly, leaving behind the smell of real earth and real life. Anyone who has lived long enough under those skies understands that beauty is never separated from labor. You do not admire the countryside from a distance only. You touch it, you harvest it, you sweat inside it, you feed other people through it. That morning, she harvested the bitter gourds with practiced hands. Each one went into the basket with quiet satisfaction. The weight grew against her arm, her body bent and rose in the old rhythm of work. Yet even in that routine, there was peace. The garden did not ask her to pretend. It did not ask her to be stronger than she was. It simply responded to care with growth. By the time she lifted the basket onto her shoulder, it was full enough to promise a good selling day. She stepped onto the road toward the countryside market, with hope moving beside her like a second shadow. The market was lively in the way only village markets can be. Not elegant, not quiet, but alive. Laughter, bargaining, greetings, the clatter of scales, the rustle of plastic bags, the smell of fish, pork, herbs, dust, and sun-warmed vegetables all mixing together beneath the open sky. Tu Tien set down her basket, straightened her blouse, and began calling out to passing women with that warm, practical voice she used when she wanted people to trust both her produce and her sincerity. The bitter gourds sold steadily. Some of the older women picked them up, turned them in their hands, and nodded approval at the flowers still attached. "Young and fresh," Tu Tien said with a smile, "straight from the garden." Some customers bought only 2. Some asked for enough to make exactly 15,000 or 20,000 dung. One woman wanted a full kilogram. Tu Tien weighed each portion carefully, added an extra piece once or twice to round the amount, gave change quickly, packed with deft fingers, and kept her tone cheerful even when the heat grew stronger and stronger over the market roof. The basket gradually emptied, and with each sale, a small, bright feeling rose inside her. Not pride in any grand sense. Something simpler. Relief? Satisfaction? The joy of knowing her hands had worked honestly, and that honesty was being rewarded, if only a little. She tucked the folded bills into her pocket neatly and felt, for a few moments, that perhaps the day might remain kind. But kindness in life rarely stays untouched for long. By afternoon, after selling almost everything, she kept only a few bitter gourds aside. Those were for Jack. She went to the pork stall and bought fresh meat, already imagining the meal she would make later. Then she returned home with the remaining vegetables, the meat, and the tiredness of a woman who never truly stopped moving. The house greeted her with a familiar quiet. "Miu," she called softly. The cat came at once, weaving around her legs with the confidence of a creature who believes love should always be available. Tu Tien crouched, stroked its back, and gave it food before lifting her eyes toward the sky. The light had changed. The bright warmth of morning was giving way to something heavier. The clouds were thickening in a way that suggested late rain, or at least a sudden dimming of the evening. She knew what that meant in the countryside. Time had to be used well before weather changed again. And more than that, Jack would be home soon. She wanted food waiting for him. Not just food, but comfort. Inside the kitchen, she called him. Her voice carried worry more than she meant it to. She asked if he was coming home soon. He told her he would finish soon. That was all. Yet his voice seemed a little hoarse, a little more tired than usual, and her heart tightened in response. So she began. She sliced the bitter gourds thinly and soaked some of them in salted water to soften their bitterness. She mixed minced meat with chopped scallions, pepper, seasoning, and egg, then carefully stuffed the filling into the hollowed gourds for soup. Another portion she set aside to stir-fry with eggs. The stove fire caught beneath the pan with a quick flare, filling the room with heat, smoke, and the first deep fragrance of cooking food. As she moved through each step, she thought of Jack. Not as others might think of him, the capable man, the one who handled things, the one who said it would be fine. She thought of the weariness underneath, the hoarse voice, the pressure around the bank debt. The fact that when financial trouble settles over a household, it does not sit only on numbers. It sits in shoulders, in sleep, in the way a person eats, in the way a smile becomes thinner day by day. The bitter gourd soup simmered. The eggs met the pan. Pork floss added its rich scent to the room. Rice steamed. In another house, perhaps such a meal would have been ordinary. In hers, tonight, it felt almost ceremonial, not because the food was expensive, but because she was preparing it with the knowledge that something difficult needed to be said before the night ended. Then the door opened. Jack stepped inside, carrying the dust and heat of the day with him. When he saw the table, when he smelled the bitter gourd and the warm rice, his whole face changed. Tu Tien greeted him at once, telling him to wash his hands and come eat while everything was hot. He obeyed with the tired ease of a man who knows he is safe at last for the evening. They sat together. The meal looked simple but full. White rice, stuffed bitter gourd soup, stir-fried bitter gourd with eggs, pork floss. The The kind of food made not to impress, but to steady the spirit. Jack tasted the soup first and looked at her with something close to wonder. He praised her. He asked what she had harvested today. She smiled and told him bitter gourds. He laughed softly and said she was becoming too skillful. She pretended to complain about the weather, about the market, about the stubbornness of the cat, and for a little while, the room became light. Then he told her about Uncle Dune, about the land, 2 hectares, an old house, negotiation from 200 million down to 180, the promise of peace, of farming, of starting fresh near Jack's own land. As he spoke, she listened with genuine happiness for the older man. A successful purchase, a new chapter, a little piece of good news inside a season that had not been generous. For a few minutes, both of them smiled without forcing it. But peaceful moments often arrive carrying the truth that makes them hurt more. The meal slowed, the clink of chopsticks softened. Outside, the weather darkened further. Inside, Tu Tien found herself looking at him longer than usual. Not at his face alone, but at the exhaustion sitting inside him like a second person at the table. She could not keep silent. Her voice trembled when she finally asked about his hoarseness, about the dryness in the weather, about whether he had been sleeping at all. Then, almost as if the words had been waiting all day at the edge of her throat, she spoke the real fear. The bank debt. She did not accuse. She did not demand. She only looked at him with the deep ache of someone who can no longer bear to watch another person pretend he is not drowning. Then she said the thing that broke her own heart even as she said it. Maybe they should sell the farm. The words hung there heavily between them. Move down there, she continued softly. Live somewhere smaller, somewhere cheaper. Start again if they must. She told him she was willing. Her old life had been much harder than this. As long as she could stay beside him, no place would feel too poor, no beginning too humble. She spoke with all the sincerity she had, because love had stripped her of any need to sound proud. Jack listened in silence. When he finally answered, he thanked her not in a casual way, but with the deep, quiet gratitude of a man who realizes someone has just placed her own happiness on the table and offered to trade it for his survival. She told him again that no one was to blame. The most important thing was that they remain together and face what came next side by side. They spoke then not like dreamers, but like 2 people standing in the middle of a hard truth. They could find someone to transfer the farm gradually. They would tell Mother Loie later, not now, not until something was more certain, so she would not carry unnecessary sorrow. Tu Tien said again, very softly, that as long as she could be near him every day, any place would be enough. That was the painful dignity of the evening. No dramatic collapse, no shouting, no accusation, only 2 people eating a countryside meal while deciding, gently and painfully, how much they were willing to lose in order to protect one another from losing even more. By the time they finished, the air inside the house felt warmer, not because their problems had vanished, but because they had finally been spoken aloud. And perhaps that was the truth waiting underneath the whole day. Bitter gourd is bitter, yet it nourishes. Some seasons scorch the skin, yet they ripen courage. Some meals are not meals at all, but acts of love served in bowls. And sometimes the deepest proof of love is not promising to hold on to everything beautiful, but being willing to let go of what you cherish most, so the one beside you does not break under the weight of trying to keep it all.